Selamat pagi, kawan-kawan. Kita kembali lagi di Perspicere untuk yang keempat kalinya. Kali ini kita semua akan berdiskusi mengenai advice to Christians, uh, advice ya, career advice for Christian Philosophers. Dan kali ini nanti kita akan berdiskusi bersama Hereth. Tapi hari ini saya seperti biasa nggak sendirian. Ada juga teman saya, yaitu ada Angga di sini. Halo, Angga.
Oi, halo.
Ya, jadi seperti biasa kami akan berdua dan saat ini kami juga menunggu salah satu teman kami yaitu Faiz. Nanti juga akan segera bergabung sesingkat-singkatnya. Ya. Dan tanpa berlama-lama lagi, kami juga nggak cuma berdua kali ini, terutama kita akan kedatangan Hereth, Dr. Blake. Hi, Dr. Blake.
Hi.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking your time to come here in our show, small collective in Indonesia.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm really grateful to have you here. So maybe let me introduce you first to the audience, Blake. So, jadi kawan-kawan, Blake ini adalah postdoctoral research associate dari University of Massachusetts Lowell, dan dia bekerja bersama Dr. Nicholas Evans dan Mel Shortland untuk mengerjakan isu-isu seperti isu-isu terkait pasifisme, terutama di dalam topik yang namanya fighter participation in the development and testing of artificial intelligence. Selain itu, minat riset dari Blake juga ada di neuroethics, bioethics, applied ethics, dan terutama yang akan kita bahas hari ini, yaitu di dalam filsafat agama and philosophy of religion. So, yeah, thank you for that you're coming here, Blake. So, before we start, we usually ask these questions for those who come here. So, we usually ask first for them, what is philosophy and philosophy of religion, and last, what makes you decide to be a academician, a scholar in philosophy? Yeah.
So thanks again for having me, and thanks for the question. So in answer to the first question of what is philosophy, and connected to that, what is philosophy of religion? I mean, at least for me, it's hard to give a really crisp, good definition that encompasses all the different kinds of philosophical practice. But I think, at least for me personally, philosophy is a kind of conceptual examination of the world around us on a kind of deep level. And it's the sort of thing that we ask the sort of questions that typically can't be answered by way of science and things like that. So I think broadly that's sort of how I think of philosophy. In terms of what philosophy of religion is, I think it's taking those kinds of tools and bringing them to questions about religion on a kind of broad level. So I think there's also such a thing as philosophical theology or philosophy of theology, which is more about particular religious doctrines like the incarnation or the Trinity or avatars in Hinduism, things like that. But philosophy of religion is very broad, and it's concerned with fundamental questions about religion that are central to most, if not all, religions. So that's what I think is going on there. I don't have too much, insightful to say about all of that. But in terms of what got me into philosophy, so I grew up very conservative religious. And one of my youngest brother, I'm the oldest of 8 children, and my youngest brother was born with Down syndrome, so he was born disabled. And I didn't know exactly what this meant, and so it was a big struggle for my family to think about, why would God let something like this happen, so on and so forth. Reactions that now I think are very ableist. I think they're negative attitudes to have towards people with disabilities, in particular negative attitude to have towards somebody with Down syndrome, because really there's nothing bad about Down syndrome. It's just another way of being in the world. But that experience got me asking questions about about religion and about faith and about my own experiences, particularly as a young queer person. I wondered at the time, if this was some sort of divine punishment or something like that on me, and um, for being queer. And of course, I don't think it is, and I don't think it was then. But those are the kind of thoughts that I was going through at the time in the religion in which I was raised. So that's what got me interested in philosophy, and I sort of accidentally ended up taking an intro to philosophy course in college, and it got me very interested, and the rest is history.
I see. That's I think it's starting from very personal things, yeah, Blake.
Yeah. I mean, I think for some people, the questions themselves are always interesting. That's where they start. It kind of starts a bit as an intellectual journey that's not occasioned by any kind of special personal experience. But for me, it was occasioned by a personal or set of personal experiences where I no longer knew how to make sense of my world. And the tools that philosophy, and particularly philosophy of religion at the time, was bringing, and was encouraging me to ask and answer these questions in ways that I hadn't imagined, was very appealing.
Wow, thank you. Yeah, really
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, thanks for
But
the question.
yeah. I think we could start. Okay, that's interesting. Starting from your experience and that issues of queer. So we're gonna talk about this queer advice for Christian philosophers, which an article that just published some months ago in European Journal in Philosophy of Religion. And yeah, without any further ado, the time is yours, Blake.
Okay. Thank you so much. Okay, so as everyone has been mentioned, right, the title or the topic of this talk is "Queer Advice to Christian Philosophers," and it is this article that's coming out that came out a couple months ago, I think it was, in a special issue of the European Journal for Philosophy of Religion. And what's special about it is that those of us who were invited and who contributed to the special issue were talking about the future of philosophy of religion. Where should philosophy of religion go from here? How should it change? What should stay the same? What should be different? What are the kinds of goals that should guide us? And whenever I think of that kind of question, of like, what should philosophy of religion be like, the perhaps like classical infamous paper is Alvin Plantinga's article, Advice to Christian Philosophers. So I thought about what he had to say back in the 1980s. I thought about how things have changed since then, and some of the things that Plantinga, for whom I have a lot of love and respect and admiration. I think he's a unique and brilliant philosopher. But I think that there were some things that he maybe should have said or didn't consider, that I want to say. So I'm gonna move into that. Okay. So Plantinga published his piece, right, Advice to Christian Philosophers, in 1984. And some key features of what he talked about in his article is he says, look, in the philosophical community, Christians are a group of people with special philosophical interests. They care about particular kinds of things. They care about particular kinds of doctrines. They care about how sort of mainstream or non-religious or non-Christian philosophical questions interact with or square with some of their own Christian commitments. He also thinks of Christian philosophy as a kind of political force. And he talks about this. He says, I think, the creation of places like Calvin University and other Christian colleges and universities are a way of changing a kind of secular culture in a way that brings philosophy of religion back into the academy, and encourages people who have been very dismissive of religion to take it seriously. So he critiques the logical positivists, right, and Bertrand Russell and their site, right, the Vienna Circle, and some of these folks as people who, they wanted to sideline questions about God and religion as not worthy of sustained philosophical attention. And I agree with Plantinga that I think that was a mistake. So I'm not a positivist, and I have the same sort of disagreements with the Vienna Circle that Plantinga does. But nevertheless, whatever else you think of that, he also wants to talk about Christian philosophy as a kind of conservative political force, as a kind of way of bringing back, or a kind of ancient religion to a place of respectability in the academy. And finally, the other thing that he emphasizes in his article is he says, look, I think it's the job of Christian philosophers to serve the Christian community. So Plantinga himself is, or at least for a long time, was a member of the Christian Reformed Church, and they have a joke. So the Christian Reformed Church, for those who don't know, is just like one sort of Christian denomination. It comes out of the Dutch Reformed or Calvinist tradition, and it fits alongside like Episcopalians and Baptists and so on and so forth. And the saying in the Christian Reformed Church is, "In the body of Christ, we're the brain," which is a very sort of funny thing to say, and like it very much fits the spirit of the CRC. But in that sort of way, even that kind of way of thinking about it, even if you think it's a little egotistical and a little tongue-in-cheek, you can still see that like it's still part of the body, right? The brain, however important or privileged a place you give it, it still serves the rest of the body. Okay. And it can't function without the heart and without the lungs and so on and so forth. So there's, for Plantinga, this idea of Christians, including Christian philosophers, the brains of the Christian community, serving the broader Christian community, fits that analogy really tightly, right? They're kind of the brain that serves the rest of the body. So that should be the goal of Christian philosophers, he said, is to take seriously the concerns of people in the church and whatever the obligations are of the Christian community. Those, right, should be taken seriously and should kind of set the agenda for Christian philosophers. So one of the things he says, and I really like this passage because he lays out his vision really nicely here. So I'll just read it briefly since it's just a short passage, but he says, so the Christian philosopher has his own topics. Notice he's saying his. That's another thing I think that is not intentionally political in Plantinga's way, but it reflects a kind of political judgment about like who the Christian philosopher is. It's a male, it's a man, right? So the Christian philosopher has his own topics and projects to think about. And when he thinks about the topics of current concern in the broader philosophical world, he will think about them in his own way, which may be a different way. He may have to reject certain currently fashionable assumptions as to what are the proper starting points and procedures for philosophical endeavor. And this is crucially important, the Christian philosopher has a perfect right to the point of view and pre-philosophical assumptions he brings to philosophic work. The fact that these are not widely shared outside the Christian or theistic community is interesting, but fundamentally irrelevant. Okay. Now, notice in some sort of way, like there's again something kind of political about this, because on the one hand, Plantinga is surely right to suggest that just because some other view is popular and Christians don't share a popular view, where he talks a lot in other papers about how materialism or physicalism about the human person is like the most popular, the dominant view among philosophers. And he says, hey, look, I don't think just because it's the dominant or popular view that we have to kind of use that as a starting point, that we don't have to adopt an assumption just because it's fashionable. But some of this language that he uses here, right, that Christian philosophers have a right to whatever assumptions they want. That's an interesting sort of claim. You don't see Plantinga using this sort of language in a lot of his other professional writing. You see him talk about justification. You see him talking about warrant. You don't see him as much talking about what sort of right that people have to bring certain kinds of views to the table. So it's interesting language that I think is political in a particular kind of way. So if you look at some of the critiques of the philosophical canon, Plantinga's is one kind of critique of the canon, of this way of cutting out philosophy of religion and of taking not just Christian philosophy, but Islamic philosophy, Jewish philosophy, Hindu philosophy, right, and casting it aside. And right, he's critiquing that. But Anita Allen is somebody else who has critiqued the canon. And I like the way that she flips it. She flips the question from, instead of saying, well, what is it that Black women can bring to philosophy, she says, well, what is it that philosophy can bring to Black women? So she asked this question, with all due respect, what does philosophy have to offer Black women? It's not obvious to me that philosophy has anything special to offer Black women today. I make this provocative claim to shift the burden to the discipline to explain why it is good enough for us. We should be tired of always having to explain how and prove that we are enough for the discipline. So this kind of way of shifting the burden, but again, in a very sort of like, there's something also obviously political about what Anita Allen is saying here as well. So just to say it's political doesn't mean it's bad, right? I mean, I think some of Plantinga's politics I have real disagreement with, some of them I agree with. But Anita Allen is saying something political in this broad, descriptive sense too, right? Fundamentally, what she's saying is the exclusion of Black women from the long history of philosophy is something that the discipline needs to justify. And if the discipline wants Black women to be a part of it, it needs to offer Black women something of value, right? Why should Black women spend their lives, their efforts, their emotional, their intellectual energies, which are already overspent in a culture, right, in a world that's very racist and that oppresses them in a variety of ways, not just as Black individuals, but also as women? Why should they invest these resources, which are already strained, to a discipline that doesn't, right, that clearly doesn't seem to want them in many ways? Okay, so that is the background, right? And that kind of brought me to this question of, well, look, when I wrote this paper 2020, right, what does analytic philosophy of religion offer queer people? And one sort of immediate answer is, well, look, queer people, just like non-queer people, can be interested in questions of divine foreknowledge, in the nature of divine providence, in the problem of evil, right? There's no sort of reason why people can't be interested in that. John Corvino, right, is a famous gay philosopher who grew up Catholic and is interested in some of these questions in philosophy of religion. Isn't that enough? I don't really think that's enough, because that's just a way of saying, hey, look, these things just are interesting to people regardless of what their identities are, regardless of what their background is. And there's no denying that that's valuable and that's important. I am personally interested in some of these questions. I think the literature on divine foreknowledge is fascinating. I have nothing to say other than Molinism is true. But you're right, that's the right answer. But I have nothing to say, you know, in particular about it, nothing to contribute to that literature, but it's interesting to me, just as a person who finds, you know, any number of things intellectually curious. But it doesn't seem like philosophy of religion has an easy answer to this question if we rephrase it. Instead of what does analytic philosophy of religion offer queer people, we can change the question to what does analytic philosophy of religion offer queer people qua queer people, or as queer people? And I think the answer to that is not much. I think that philosophy of religion has proven to be pretty politically insulated, unlike, say, ethics or epistemology. So I think for the most part, and this is a claim fundamentally about analytic philosophy of religion. So I think continental philosophy of religion has been much better on this front, even though I'm very analytic in my methodology and in my bent and interest. But I think for all the methodological disagreements I have with a lot of continental philosophers, and with a lot of continental approaches to philosophy, I think that they have done a better job on average of thinking about the specific interests of different kinds of embodied ways of being in the world. They have done a better job thinking about, well, what it's like to be white in the world may be very different from what it's like not to be white in the world, in time, not just in terms of how you interpret the world and how you see things, but also in terms of sometimes the kinds of things you care about. And we see a lot more development, you know, a lot more of political penetration in areas of philosophy like ethics and epistemology, where even in analytic philosophy, we have feminist ethics and we have feminist epistemology, we have ethics of care, we have all these kinds of things, but you don't find as much of that in analytic philosophy of religion. And this was something that was frustrating for me for a long time, because I thought, oh, well, there are lots of these really interesting questions in philosophy of religion that I care about, just like people who aren't queer care about. You know, we can have discussions about divine foreknowledge all day long. But is there anything philosophy of religion has to say about me as a queer person? And sometimes it seems like the answer is, well, if you want to know what philosophy of religion has to say about you as a queer person, read Thomas Aquinas. And I thought, no, I don't want to read Aquinas. Like, I've read Aquinas. I don't need more natural law condemning what I have to say. But I'm asking all these questions about, what is the afterlife going to be like for trans people? Are trans people going to get to have like a gender affirming surgeries, or like to change bodies in the afterlife? Is that a possibility? And it's very interesting because I had some of the initial negative reaction to me asking these questions was, oh, well, that is so speculative. That's so speculative. How can you it's just not legitimate at all, right? We can't form justified beliefs at all about these kinds of issues, about whether trans people will be able to transition, or whether people will have certain kinds of sexual orientations in the afterlife, or those kinds of questions. But if you look at the kinds of questions, right, the kinds of answers and speculation that you get from Aquinas and Augustine and some of the great, historical philosophers of religion, they don't show any kind of hesitation when it comes to speculation. They speculate all day long about the afterlife. I mean, think of Dante, right? What an imagination, okay? And even Aquinas, when he talks about the nature of hell, right? And how, like, part of human redemption is going to be smelling the burning flesh of the damned, and so we can celebrate in the justice of it. I don't understand how we can know that that's true, but we can't know that trans people may get to switch bodies as a matter of justice. That seems to me to reveal a certain kind of political bias, right? That we can know that, like, conservative theological doctrines are true, but not that progressive theological doctrines are true. So, right, I'm skeptical about some of this. Okay. In terms of, I'm not going to say too much about this, but suffice it to say that if you want further evidence that analytic philosophy of religion doesn't do a particularly good job of offering queer people as queer people something to think about in their particular identities in philosophy of religion, and the same with women, you can look at some of the data on just what percentage of philosophers of religion are women or are non-binary. So basically, if you're not a man, Helen de Cruz says in 2018 that it's probably about 17%, which, when you consider the fact that the huge bulk of that, probably like 15 to 16%, is women, even fewer non-binary folks. Christina Van Dyke in 2015 estimated as being lower, so maybe it's kind of a little bit better over time. And I think another question this should bring us to ask is, why are there so few non-queer advocates of queer philosophy of religion? Because there are lots of philosophers of religion, and they're interested in all kinds of different things. They run the gamut from the very politically conservative, and theologically conservative, like William Lane Craig, all the way to folks who are much more like politically and theologically progressive, like Christina Van Dyke, or like my friend Kevin Timpey, right? So on and so forth. Why is it that there are so few non-queer people, cisgender straight people, who are fans of doing philosophy of religion in a way that appeals to the interests of queer people? Okay. So, like I said, I kind of want to offer just some brief advice that I think, again, at this very young, right age, very early in my career, that I've noticed over time as a queer person. So, right, I'm only 33 years old. I'm not particularly old. I'm not as studied or experienced as some of these really great philosophers of religion who've come along. But the one thing I can say is that I've been in philosophy of religion long enough and that I've been queer long enough to know what has kind of been offered and what hasn't been offered in terms of analytic philosophy of religion? What kind of topics are considered legitimate and mainstream, and what kind of questions are considered fringe or peripheral or unacceptable? So my advice is primarily advice like Plantinga's was for Christian philosophers of religion. And there are a few reasons for this. So first of all is because most people doing philosophy of religion nowadays are Christians. This was true in Plantinga's time. This is true today, maybe to a lesser extent. I think we're seeing a resurgence of Jewish philosophy of religion and Islamic philosophy of religion, and to an extent Hindu philosophy of religion. That's something I hope to contribute to. But still, the majority of people who do philosophy of religion are Christians. The second reason is because if you look at the major places to study philosophy of religion, at least within the United States, those institutions are Christian. Notre Dame, you're at University of Notre Dame, St. Louis University in Missouri, Calvin University, right? The first two are Catholic, the third one is Protestant, but all of these programs are distinctively Christian in their outlook. And finally, because if you look at most philosophy of religion, what is it about? Well, it's usually about the Christian God, or it's about the Christian religion. And that goes for philosophical theology or philosophy of theology as well. Okay. And a lot of times you'll see philosophers of religion who are Christians will say things at the beginning of their papers or their presentations where they'll say, well, what I'm about to say, about the problem of evil or about divine foreknowledge, it's relevant under any of the Abrahamic religions. So if you're Christian, if you're Muslim, if you're Jewish, but then they say, but I'll only talk about the Christian tradition because that's the tradition I'm most familiar with. And so it ends up kind of being a de facto kind of way of like doing Christian philosophy of religion rather than just philosophy of religion simpliciter or something. Okay. So I think Christian philosophers of religion are in the best position to change the field of philosophy of religion. I think that Plantinga hasn't teased out all of the implications of his views. I also think that to a great extent, some of his advice, both in terms of what he said and what's entailed by what he says, hasn't really been followed. So one of the things he says that I like in his essays, he says, we must therefore pursue our projects with integrity, with independence, and with Christian boldness. So I think a little bit about that bit of integrity. I think that a Christian philosopher's commitment to integrity requires righting the wrongs of the Christian community, both historic and contemporary. Okay, and that's what I'm going to focus on as it concerns queer people. Okay, so first piece of advice, right, of like three pieces of advice. First bit of advice is that Christian philosophers as a group, they have a responsibility to communities their group has oppressed to prioritize the interests of the oppressed. So the basic argument behind that is, right, goes something like this. Christians have a group obligation to prioritize the interests of the oppressed, particularly individuals or groups they have historically oppressed. So if you've studied political philosophy at all, one of the things that you'll see in Robert Nozick, who's a libertarian, and all the way up to John Rawls, who's like a political liberal, is they think that they have this baseline commitment of our fundamental obligation and whose interests are we going to prioritize? How are we going to think of, there are a lot of people who have competing interests in the world. Whose interests should we prioritize? And the consensus answer seems to be the oppressed, the worst off, those who have been downtrodden the most, who most need help, whose interests have so far unjustly been least prioritized. Jesus even talks about caring for the least of these, and insofar as you've done it to the least of these, you've done it unto me. And particular though, right, there's a subgroup of the oppressed. Some people out there in the world who are oppressed, they're not oppressed by me. They're oppressed by other people. By contrast, there are other people who are oppressed in the world who are oppressed by me. I'm responsible for it. So for instance, I'm responsible in some maybe loose sense as an American for some kinds of oppression that the United States carries out around the world in a way that, say, I may not be as responsible. Like, I'm maybe more responsible for the plight of people in Afghanistan than I am for the plight of people in, say, Papua New Guinea or something like that, right? Where the US hasn't really intervened as of recently. So we should think that if we're going to prioritize the interests of the oppressed, fundamentally, we should, in that group, prioritize the people that we have oppressed more than anyone else. All right, so premise 2, if that's the case, then Christian philosophers have a group obligation to prioritize the philosophical interests of the oppressed, particularly individuals or groups that Christians have historically oppressed, and queer people are one of those groups. So part of their obligation is not just to, right, because if we're talking about the obligation of Christian philosophers as part of the broader Christian community, it's different than talking about the obligation of, say, Christian doctors, medical doctors as part of the Christian community. Maybe Christian medical doctors have some sort of obligation to care for the medical needs of the oppressed, and in particular, the medical needs of individuals who are oppressed by the Christian community. But Christian philosophers, at least speaking for myself, we're not particularly good at medicine. That's not the kind of skill we bring to the table. If we prioritize your medical interests, we're unlikely to help you very much. But we can prioritize your philosophical interests. We can take the kind of questions that you take seriously, the kind of experience that we have sidelined and suppressed, and instead start taking it seriously. So I think that's what it's going to look like. So that's the first piece of advice. The second piece of advice is that Christian philosophers must prioritize queer voices by creating or furthering academic space. So conferences, journals, books, academic postings for people, for those who publicly and professionally identify as queer. So if you look at the long history of some of the academic wrongs that Christians have perpetrated, they come in both general and specific forms. In general forms, Christians, like a lot of other groups, they've stigmatized, sidelined, ridiculed queer people and their perspectives. It doesn't take much research into the long history of Christian philosophy and Christian theology to find that there is a pretty anti-queer bent in it. And also sometimes this takes specific forms. So some of the Christian intellectual traditions are very powerfully anti-queer. So if you look at, when Richard Swinburne gave a keynote address at the Society of Christian Philosophers back in, I forget when it was, 2013, 2014, something of that sort, and was talking about how he thought being gay was a disability and that disabilities are bad and should be cured, and therefore gayness should also be cured as well. There was a whole reaction to that in his defense, right? When Michael Ray, who was then president, I believe, or executive director of the Society of Christian Philosophers, and Christina Van Dyke, who I forget, maybe was treasurer or vice president or something like that at the time, I forget, when they said, hey, look, we apologize to any people, particularly queer or disabled people, who were hurt and who feel unwelcome in Christian philosophy as a result of hearing this discussion. And then they emphasize that the Society of Christian Philosophers is a space for both very conservative traditional Christians like Richard Swinburne, but also a place for very progressive queer Christians, right, as well. And then there was this big reaction to that of people saying, oh, well, they're insulting Richard Swinburne by doing this, as opposed to just kind of reach out to people who were potentially harmed by what he had to say and ensuring that they knew that they were just as welcome as Richard Swinburne. So I think when it comes to righting these wrongs, there has to be a lot of openness to listening and learning from queer people, to learning a little bit about these perspectives that for so long have been sidelined, stigmatized, and ridiculed. And there has to be an intentional promotion of queer leadership, of trying to put Christian or queer people in positions of power and influence in a way that they were unjustly denied in the past purely because they were queer. All right, and then the third piece of advice is that Christian philosophers, and this is maybe the most controversial one, is that Christian philosophers have to mitigate or hold back they're criticisms of queers where such criticisms would undermine their efforts toward compensatory or reparative justice. So there are two reasons for, I think, for thinking this is true. Number one is that criticizing queer people perpetuates a kind of domination in conversation. So already there is this problem with white people like me, and with non-queer people, and with non-disabled people, and with non-women, and so on, right? Taking up too much of the oxygen in the conversation. And so part of fixing this problem is to let queer people talk and let them have their time of day and recognize that queer interests and queer philosophy, particularly queer philosophy of religion, may not be as well developed or well thought out in some cases because it has not really had time to flourish, because there has been this historical stranglehold on queer philosophy of religion. It has not been allowed to grow. It has not been allowed to evolve. It has not been nourished and nurtured by more senior people in the discipline. The second sort of reason for this is that if you just say, well, philosophy's philosophy, and if you're wrong or if there's anything wrong with your argument or with your way of doing philosophy, then we get to attack you. In other words, if you think that criticism of queer people, of queer philosophers, just like any other philosophers, that there should be no holds barred, there's no cap, there are no rules, it's just dog eat dog, then you're going to be in this sort of situation where you're going to perpetuate anti-queer stigma and self-silencing. You're going to continue this sort of attitude, right? Queers feel unwelcome enough. And we should recognize that when I, as a philosophy professor, criticize, say, a graduate student, one graduate student who's a white man versus one graduate student who's an Asian woman, that they may not receive that in the same way. That the white man may just think that what I'm doing, right, is just, critiquing his work, taking him seriously, so on. Whereas the Asian woman has an experience, right, has a long experience, at least typically, of not being taken seriously as somebody who is not white, as somebody who is a woman. And so me shutting her down or critiquing her in this way has a kind of added effect and significance. Regardless of what my intentions are, that can be the effect on this person. So I think that if you look at our history, right, or look at the history of Christianity, Christians have spoken too much and they've listened too little. Okay. So ultimately what I think is that I think if people are going to be Christian philosophers of religion are going to have integrity, then they're going to protect the vulnerable, which includes queer people. They are going to prioritize the interests of groups who are wronged by the Christian community. And I think that includes the group of queer people as a whole in various places around the world. So I think queering philosophy of religion in this way is a small step towards justice. It's not the only step that needs to be taken. We need to do this. Christian philosophers need to do this for a lot more groups than just queer people. They need to do it for, for Black philosophers of religion. They need to do it for, feminist philosophers of religion and for women, other people who have been historically sidelined and silenced. But it's still a small step. It's still a small piece of advice for how we can make things at least just a little bit better going forward. So the way I summarize it is, right, my advice for queer philosophy of religion is it's here, it's queer, get into it. Okay, make room for it. That's everything.
Thank you so much, Blake. It's really great closing. It's clear. It's here. Get into it, and I think it's also important here to think about these kind of things here in Indonesia, because what we experience, and I think Greg, our friends down here, who also identifies himself as a queer, we rarely see queer philosophers here in Indonesia, and I really hope this presentation will inspire people, queer people, my junior in university to do philosophy of religion and do it in their own perspective as a queer people. And again, thank you so much, Blake, for this.
My
Yeah.
pleasure.
Yeah. Okay. I wanna ask some questions first. Like, so I wonder first. You already elaborate some of these things, but is it possible? I wanna ask this one thing again. So, um, but I often hear things like, in academia, your identity doesn't matter whether you're Asian, black, queer, lesbian, bisexual. What important is your idea, right? I believe that you often hear those kind of things. So yeah, what is your response to that kind of statement?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the statement is false, and I think that it's not just false, but I think it's pernicious. So I think the general idea behind it is that, or what people think is behind it, is they have this very egalitarian idea of doing philosophy, which is no matter what your race is, no matter where you grew up, no matter what your gender identity is, whether you're a man or a woman, whether you're outside the gender binary, whether you like guys, girls, something else, none of the above, whatever, whether you're rich or poor, you can do philosophy and you can have a good idea. And I think, of course, that's true, right? Like on some level, I don't really think that, that there are certain groups of people who just by their very nature can't do anything interesting in philosophy. Certainly not whole groups like, racial groups or gender identity groups or things like that. But what I think that sort of view goes overboard in thinking that it therefore it doesn't matter. That just because everyone or every kind of, every group can contribute some kind of important philosophical idea regardless of what their identities are, that therefore their identities don't have any kind of impact or any kind of special importance because they have those identities. I don't think that's true. um so for instance, you know uh there's been a long-standing critique of metaphysics. Mari Mikkola has this really interesting piece on feminist metaphysics and philosophical methodology, in which she says, hey, look, there are a lot of mainstream metaphysicians who think that metaphysics is apolitical, right? That it has no kind of political goals. It just kind of asks, well, what things are real and why should we believe they're real? Do we have free will in the libertarian sense? Do we have it in the compatibilist sense? Is determinism a threat to moral responsibility? Those kind of questions, and it's not political. Whereas feminist philosophy is political. But here's the thing: metaphysics, mainstream metaphysics, doesn't just seek to answer questions like what things exist, right? It doesn't just try to discover any kind of metaphysical truths. Rather, it tries to discover important metaphysical truths. But I think we can ask, important to whom? um, Certainly there's some people who care about these kind of questions and other people who don't. I mean, anybody who's taught an intro to philosophy class knows that some people are going to care about questions of free will or the nature of time, or recently I taught universals and particulars. Some students just don't care about it, and some of them do. So I think there's this question of like, well, what counts as an important question? To whom is it important? And I think when it comes to philosophy generally, there may be some things that matter to privileged people that don't matter to other people. And then there may be some things that matter to oppressed people that don't matter to privileged people. Um, so I think that that sort of idea that, what kind of view you have, it doesn't really matter. It's fundamentally about the idea. Um, yeah, that doesn't seem right to me. And it also, I think, is a way of saying, well, it's a way of thinking that we're kind of interchangeable. That if philosophy is dominated by white men, that's not itself a problem, because white men are just as likely to know whatever non-white women would come up with if they were in philosophy. So they think that there's not going to be this new influx of ideas that come from different identities. But we've just seen that that's not true. We've seen that all kinds of different perspectives, right, come into play, and that people, when they use their personal lived experience as a kind of launching point for doing philosophy, that the kinds of questions and the kinds of answers we get are very different. So yeah, I think that's what the question, or the assumptions behind the question, while maybe well intended in some cases, they're just false, and they're false in a way that is also really exclusive, and tends to push oppressed and traditionally underrepresented people out by saying, well, there's nothing really unique about their perspectives in those identities. I just don't think that's true.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you so much for saying that. Yeah, I think it's important, and for a bit of context, as someone who grew up in a very conservative church, evangelical church back then, when I was in my teenage years, I thought like that before, like, right, but time after time, I realized that one of the things that identity that matter most for me is my ethnicity as a Chinese Indonesian here. So it's a minority group in Indonesia, and it turns out that to be a Chinese Indonesia it's hard. It's hard. We're oppressed a lot, and that makes me realize that, well, maybe not only me as Chinese Indonesian, but also queer people, women, and yeah, it turns out, well, yeah, representation matters. Representation matters. So it started from my ethnicity first, and then I realized that maybe other identity experience what I experience as well, and that's why their identity is really matter. Identity is something that really matter, and yeah.
I think that's a great point, and it makes me think of just one other thing that I was thinking of, but that I forgot to say about this, which is that, notice that in this idea of, like, it doesn't matter what your identity is, so long as you can come up with it's the idea that matters. But here's the thing: it's not just ideas that matter; it's people who matter, right? People matter. If I don't want you in my class because you don't have any good ideas, right, I mean, it seems then that I'm not really valuing you, that I'm just kind of using you as a mere means to an end of getting the idea. So I think this idea of, like, well, it doesn't really matter that academic philosophy is dominated by non-disabled cishet white men, because all the ideas are welcome. And it's like, but not all the people are welcome. And it's bad to exclude people, right? Like, from this kind of important human endeavor of asking these fundamental questions about the world around us. So yeah, I think this idea of, like, well, so long we can exclude whoever we want, so long as the good ideas get in. No, I don't think that's right. I think that the philosophical community should be more than just an ideas factory. It should be about people and the kinds of things they care about. It should try to, look and meet people's needs and answer the questions that are important, especially because philosophers say things like this. They say, we're asking the questions that are important to the human race, and to, but it's like, no. But, like, when you exclude all these portions of the human race, right? I don't know that you're asking questions. Are we sure that it's important to the whole human race, or is it just important to white men, right? I don't think you can really say that and kind of claim that philosophy has this kind of universal importance if you're not sure, right? If you're just excluding people for whom it's important. It's kind of a way of, like, speaking on their behalf that I think is problematic.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Blake, for an amazing presentation. It's very systematic. I haven't read the paper, to be honest, but I feel like your presentation, like, presents the whole papers really, really nicely, so I can get the idea and follow your points. Well, first, I came from, like, a moral. I'm just attending philosophy classes quite recently, so I came like from a more theological background. Conservative, reform, actually, with Sam. Yeah, both coming from reform background beforehand. Yeah. But my question is, like, for me personally, I don't really, whenever I read analytic philosophy, it's very hard for me to read because it's very dry and very, very, I would say, distant. I can't feel any attachment relation to my struggles. That's why I relate and I prefer to read like more continental approach, especially a phenomenological and existential one. But from your presentations, are you trying to say that maybe by listening to queer advice, analytic philosophy can be more like relatable? Like, because then they try to take into consideration people's experiences and background. Would it make analytic philosophy less dry and more appealing to people with real struggles and real life? I don't know. I don't know what we think.
Yeah, I mean, so at least, yeah. So I think a lot is going to depend on why people find philosophy dry, right? So you mentioned that sometimes you find, and hey, sometimes I find philosophy very dry and boring, right? I fall asleep when I'm reading it. I fell asleep reading any number of different philosophy articles in grad school and as an undergrad. But so I'll say this too. So for me, when I think about the kinds of things that I read that are dry and the things that I read that are not dry, that are very rich and engaging, things like mathematics and physics and stuff like that, that's very dry for me, right? It's not remotely relatable. It can be kind of interesting on on a kind of theoretical level, but it's very dry, right? It just, the theorems are what they are, and here's what we can do with them. But when I read fiction or when I read great works of literature, one of the things that's supposed to be not dry about them is that they connect with human beings on this kind of supposedly universal level. Um, so I think that sometimes this is a problem with philosophy. Sometimes I think continental philosophy too. But I think a lot of analytic philosophy can come across as very dry because um, it's very concisely written and very straightforward. It just says, A, B, therefore C. And that's sort of dry to read, but also because it has not historically done a good job of taking seriously people's lived experiences and their identities. But regardless of like the dry, whether it's dry or interesting question to you, and again, I think that can reflect to what extent analytic philosophy is taking your identities and your experiences seriously and trying to answer questions that you care about, rather questions that somebody at Princeton who died 100 years ago cared about. Like, are the things that Frege cared about really, are those things that I care about? I mean, sometimes, but sometimes not, right? But the other thing I was going to say about this is that it seems it seems to me that there's a difference in trying to take people's well, I guess I was going to say there's a difference in trying to try to keep people awake and interested on the one hand, and then trying to tend to people's needs, including their intellectual needs. Okay, sometimes I'm reading things that tend to my intellectual needs, but it's kind of boring, right? It's meeting a need I have, but it's not really entertaining me while I do it, right? If you could take some famous work of philosophy and turn it into a Netflix show, I may get a lot more out of it. I may stay awake and binge it a lot more than I would just read the book. But I think still, part of keeping people awake, these things can be connected in a way, and that if you take people's interests seriously, which is what I think Christian philosophers of religion should be doing, they should take the interests of queer people seriously, intellectual, health wise, right, psychologically, all those kinds of things. The Christian community should care for the people it's oppressed, particularly in redressing the kinds of harms that they've inflicted upon them. And I think a lot of those are going to be intellectual harms that come from not taking their philosophical questions coming from a queer perspective seriously enough. So yeah, I think that not doing that sometimes contributes to the dryness, but I also think sometimes intellectual exercises, no matter how much they're based in your personal experience, they can be kind of dry, you know. Um, like I know that there are people who are queer who, on some level, like in a theoretical sense, they say, "Oh, I very much care about my experience as a queer person," but they're not that interested in doing queer philosophy of religion, right? They're just like, I mean, it's not that interesting to me. But I agree, it's important, right? I think there are a lot of things that are important. I think feminist metaphysics is important. I think feminist epistemology is important, but I'm not super interested in them. Okay. So I think this one thing of like, oh, we need an area of philosophy. We need philosophers to take those things seriously. But that doesn't mean that I have to be personally entertained by them. It just means I have to make room for them and not oppose their presence in philosophy, that I have to treat them as legitimate things, whether or not I'm entertained by them, whether or not they keep me awake and interested.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Greg, you want to ask something, or you want to share something about your experience as current in our community of philosophy in Indonesia?
Okay, is my voice audible? Okay. Hi Blake, thank you so much for your presentation. It was really cool. As someone who also identifies as queer, and which my interest in philosophy of religion, especially in Christianity, has been really founded based on my queerness. It really means a lot. And even as someone who is queer and interested in philosophy of religion, and I actually do really agree a lot, and I think it's a really brave move to actually wrote all of those demands on an academic paper. The first thing that I actually thought was like, wow, that's really quite a lot to ask, and that's really brave to ask to, I don't know, conservative Christian philosophers who will even take this seriously. Like, yeah. Uh, but the one thing that I would like to add is, yeah, I really like your point about how the idea of the myth of meritocracy of ideas in philosophy is, uh, yeah, it's unethical because it ignores people and but and it ignores their experience. When you first shared about your first interest and meeting with philosophy, which was deeply personal to you, I really relate to that a lot as uh, because as someone who is queer, I actually found my way to such really deep existential questions, like questioning the world, questioning my existence, questioning my God, questioning the religion I was born in, was due to the fact that I'm queer. Because, yeah, it really shook my world. It really shook my whole sense of identity and how I relate to others, to the point that, oh, this this existential crisis could be fun. Why should I learn it in philosophy? Yeah, things like that. And it got me to thinking, like, when people just assume that everyone can think the same, everyone can create equally good ideas, yeah, it really ignores how everyone has different stories, how everyone are shaped differently in their own material context. And people ignore, and I think it's ignorant to the fact that when you think of privileged white Christian man who is cis heterosexual, who grow comfortably, who who are probably living well off of their family and doesn't have to struggle a lot in their daily life. When they pursue philosophy, when they decided to enter philosophy, maybe they don't have as much questions that tend to undermine the current system. They don't have that much, they don't, they are not conditioned to question radical things. They they are not conditioned to question things radically, systemically, because they live off the comfort of this current status quo, the system that lives off the oppression of others. While when you think about minority groups, not just queer identities, but also women, uh, people of color, they most of them, based on my experience too, based on my experience of meeting with a lot of fellow queer friends and a lot of other minority identities here in Indonesia, they have really good philosophical inquiries, and they don't do it because they're and they don't come up with it because they're raised in an academic or well-off family where they're demanded to be excelling at academia, but because they have their own lived experience who that naturally produce groundbreaking and cool philosophical inquiries. And I think when when philosophy is so narrow-minded and its community is so cishet white man. Yeah, that's what we lost. The people, the experiences, the and even the logic that works behind it. Like I've seen a lot of when successful white men, people in privilege get into philosophy, the logic that works behind them will probably they would probably be pro status quo, they would probably be mostly conservative, they would probably be uh, seeing philosophy in a way that is very industrial, competitive, and uh, tend to perpetuate the toxic environment that is already happening in the academia, while these marginalized identities with their own experience of oppression, they approach philosophy as a field with approaches that are very care oriented, love oriented, very egalitarian, very much something that is actually needed uh, to make the philosophy scene less toxic and pretty much more inclusive and more loving to everyone. So yeah, I think that's what philosophy can learn, or even every field of academy can learn from marginalized identities, right? The At least the sense of solidarity that needs to be built from each other, the feeling that you really need each other to survive and stand up against this vile and oppressing system. I guess that's all my 2 cents. Thank you.
No, thanks for saying that. I agree completely with everything you said. I like the way you put it at the beginning of this meritocracy of ideas, because even if you are committed to this kind of egalitarian idea that anybody, regardless of their identities, can contribute to a good idea. One thing that does not follow from that is that we'll all be equally good judges of what is and what isn't a good idea. And I think if you look a lot at the findings of social science, in social sciences, particularly like psychology, and you look at people's, implicit attitudes and their biases and their tendency to dismiss certain kinds of views because of who they come from, and to accept other kinds of views because of who they come from, then I think this already shows that we're imperfect judges of what's a good idea and what's not. And so we need people from all different kinds of identities to take equal part in the philosophical project in order to be able to judge together what's a good idea and what's not. And another thing that you made me think of just very quickly, I want to respect your time, is that it's interesting in some ways. It's kind of surprising to me in some ways that the way philosophers, analytic philosophers, whether analytic philosophers of religion or they're in some other field, analytic ethicists or whatever, will be very dismissive of ideas from Black women philosophers or from Asian philosophers. Or recently I saw in some conversation somewhere Peter Singer, the Princeton bioethicist, was being very dismissive of African philosophy and African philosophers, as a group. He said something along the lines of, they're not really doing philosophy at his level, which I thought was a really horrible thing to say. But it's kind of interesting, because if you ask them, well, why are you so dismissive of these ideas? They'll often refer back to these kind of questions of, well, how is that real philosophy? Or how does that fit with the way that philosophy has been done in the past? And even though I think that question is really problematic, it's weird in other ways, because if you look at some of the biggest figures in the history of philosophy, if you look at Plato and you look at Wittgenstein and you look at even Plantinga in some ways more recently, or Thomas Kuhn, the reason why they were so significant is because they did challenge the status quo. They did upset all of these assumptions. They tried to bring a kind of revolutionary change to how we think about something in philosophy. And that is celebrated by philosophers, even very conservative, traditional white men philosophers who say, oh, well, philosophy was in the dark, and then Wittgenstein came along and he fixed everything, they'll say those kinds of things. But it's like, why are you so open to what Wittgenstein did, or to what Plato did, or to what Edmund Gettier did, or Alvin Goldman, but you're not open to what Anita Allen did, or you're not open to what Christy Dotson did, or you're not open to what, all of these other diverse people did, because you say, well, that doesn't really fit with the way that it's been done, or those are not the kinds of questions that we've always been asking. Right? When you celebrate other people for doing precisely that. So I think this shows this kind of problematic bias about our willingness to celebrate people who rock the boat when they're part of our group, when we identify with them in some deep way, right? When it's another white man, or when it's, whatever, people of our in-group, but not with people who look or who are very different than us in some sort of way. I think that shows this kind of bias.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Blake. Blake, I know it's already 10 p.m. there in United States. So, but can we have one more questions from one of our friends here? So it's interesting. Two questions actually, but this is the first one. Are there still people who directly and explicitly criticize LGBTQ+, or in the context of discussion, queer, in the philosophy of religion community?
Yes, there are. So there are obviously, well, maybe I shouldn't say obviously, there are people who criticize in philosophy of religion or in the Christian community, who criticize queerness and queer people, trans people, bisexuals, gays and lesbians, and so on. So Swinburne is one of those people, but the late Ben Arbor was another such person who did that. The much now disgraced Trent Doherty was somebody who did that to a significant extent. Trying to remember what his name is. Alexander Pruss at Baylor is somebody who's very critical, right? He wrote this book, One Body, which is actually a really interesting, philosophically rich book. But I mean, I think it's very sort of biased against queer people and queer relationships. So yes, there are people who take those kinds of attitudes. There are also people who, even if they may not criticize queer people directly, right? They don't attack queerness, they don't say, oh, there's something wrong if you're queer, right? Or queerness is bad. Even if they don't say those sorts of things, they still act as gatekeepers, right? They're not sympathetic to approving special issues of a journal to talk about queer issues, or to talk about, Black philosophical theology, or Hindu philosophical theology, or East Asian, philosophy of religion, or whatever the case may be. And I've known some of these people who kind of talk the talk, but they don't really walk the walk. Right? They say the right kind of things, or they say nothing at all. But then the things that they won't really go out on a branch for you. They won't choose to elevate your voice, or the voices of queer people in ways that are important. They're kind of happy with the status quo. And I think that in some ways is just as bad, or at least bad enough that it's a problem, and it's something that needs to change. I think in a situation where the Christian community has long abused and oppressed queer people, there's no such thing as benign neglect. It's just neglect. Whether if you are okay with the status quo, if you're doing nothing to change it. I like the way Robin Dembroff at Yale talks about this. They say, when it comes to like the gender binary, everything we do is either a stabilizing or a destabilizing influence on the gender binary. There are things we can do to kind of affirm it, or at least keep it in place, not challenge it. And there are other things that we can do to disrupt it, to change things, right? I can wear earrings. I can wear pink, I can do all these kind of things to disrupt the gender binary. And I think it's the same sort of thing with the status quo. There are ways of stabilizing it, which includes sometimes doing nothing. And then there are ways of destabilizing it. And I think if you really want to be an ally, and if you really want to be on the right side of this and meet your obligations as a Christian philosopher, then you need to destabilize the status quo. And even though the quote gets misused and is overused, I like the quote of the American civil rights activist Martin Luther King Jr., who said, in the end, the thing we will remember are not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. And I think that's often the way it was. If you look in the Bible, I always think of that story of when Saint Stephen was stoned in the Bible, and St. Paul, who was then Saul of Tarsus, he didn't throw any rocks at Stephen, but he stood there and said nothing. He held everyone's cloaks while they did it. And I think that's bad enough. I think it's not enough to say, hey, I never threw a stone. I think you have to do a lot more than that. Certainly if you're going to follow in the example of Jesus, whose whole life was doing a lot more about, right? It's right there in Anselm, right? Why did God become human, right? To be with us and to advocate for us, and not to let the status quo be that way forever, but to change things in a way that brought everyone to him. And loving his enemies even until the end, and so on. So taking an active role. And I think that's the duty of Christian philosophers, particularly ones who are going to take seriously the example of Jesus.
Wow, thank you so much. Blake, one last question with the same thing. Is it fine?
Yeah.
So
yeah,
it's
sure.
interesting. So the first one, same person. Are there any interesting queer themes to discuss? What do you think about this? And the same is about from Semuas G. What do you think about interfaith queerness? So yeah.
So the first question of interesting themes to discuss. I mean, I'll just talk about my own experience. So one thing that I've really been interested in is talking about queerness, or like the place of trans people and non-binary people in the afterlife, and whether they will. So I published a piece on this. I think it was 2020 or 2021. In a book. It's available on my website for free. You can get a PDF of it there if you want to read it, but it's called The Shape of Trans Afterlife Justice. So I mentioned earlier that there are a lot of people who ask these questions about, what is heaven going to be like? Are we going to be free in heaven, or are we not? What about hell? Can people get out of heaven? Is everyone going to get saved? They do all this kind of speculation about the afterlife, which I think is really interesting and valuable. But I ask questions like, well, what about transgender people who didn't get a reasonable opportunity to transition, right? To have a kind of body that comports with their gender identity in this life. Will they get that kind of opportunity in the next life? And what will be the role of people who were transphobic, the people who oppressed them? Are they going to be obligated to affirm them in their identities? Is God going to make them do this? So that's something of like personal interest to me. But in some ways, I'm kind of embarrassed not to have a long list of themes of queer philosophy of religion to give you, right? Because here I am talking about the value of doing it. But in some ways, it's because, it just not a lot has been done. And I think that queer philosophy of religion is in many ways just starting. And I can talk about some things that are of importance to me, but, don't let my short list be discouraging. It just means that we need to make a longer and better list. We need to expand the kinds of things we get into it. So when I say it's here, it's queer, get into it, I mean, start making it happen. Make stuff to talk about. I mean, that's what philosophers have always done. That's what Plato did. That's what Bertrand Russell did. He said, hey, no one's ever said this before. I'll say it and we'll see what happens. Let's get creative. Let's start thinking about new things to bring to the table that are of importance to queer people, and let queer people bring their concerns to the table, their questions to the table. What kind of things are important to you as a queer person in philosophy of religion? The second question was about, was it about interfaith queerness? Yes. So I don't know exactly. I'm trying to figure out how best to interpret that question. Is interfaith queerness queer people who are members of various faiths?
Yeah,
Or is
probably, yeah.
is that what it is? Okay. So it's one person who's like a member of multiple faiths?
Oh no, I think it's more like interreligious dialogue about queer.
Oh, yes. So I think I think it's a good thing. I think it should happen. I mean, in some ways, I'm already doing that, right? So I'm not Christian, I'm Hindu, but I'm engaging with Christian philosophers of religion because, of course, I grew up as a Christian, and was a Christian philosopher of religion in the past. And so I'm taking some of my new perspectives that I've gained, as part of my Hindu faith and being Hindu, to talking with Christian philosophers about how can we best repair the harms these communities, because of course it's not just Christians who have historically oppressed queer people, right? Muslims, Jews, right? Hindus, Buddhists, have historically oppressed queer people in a lot of different kinds of ways. Judaism is one example of this. Is like it was a fertility cult in a lot of different ways, and so these ideas that like sex is fundamentally about reproduction, and they condemned onanism, this idea of wasting your sperm or things like that, ended up being like very anti-queer in their implications, because they viewed queer men in particular, right, as wasting sperm. So I think there's a lot to discuss about the harms that various religions have imposed on queer people and other groups besides. And yeah, it's going to be an obligation of these different kinds of religions to come together at some point and say, what are our obligations as members of these particular religions, paying attention to not just how, but also where in the world we've oppressed queer people and where should we begin our efforts. But also this question of how can we work together to fix things. I think there's already a lot of interfaith work in, helping the poor and the needy, in responding to world hunger, all these kinds of things. I would love to see more like additional and bigger interfaith efforts to repair, right? Make reparations to queer communities that have been harmed by different religions.
Oh, wow. Yeah, important stuff as well. So yeah, it's already 10:22, I guess, there in United States. And yeah, here
Yeah.
we are. Philosophy, we're talking philosophy early in the morning and late in the night. And yeah, we really sorry if we take a lot of time. So we talk more than an hour. So yeah.
I'm long-winded, but thank you for having me so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming here, and I hope, friends, I hope these discussions will inspire you to do queer philosophy of religion. So remember this statement: it's queer, it's here. Get into here. So yeah, and it's also the motto for you, Greg. So yeah, teman-teman, kita bakalan tutup ini. Thank you udah datang. Semoga diskusi kali ini insightful, dan kita ketemu lagi di lain waktu di tempat-tempat lainnya dari Perspicere. Dan yeah, we'll see you later in next weeks for the next discussions. Thank you, Black. We'll see you here again, hopefully.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Vic.
Thank you.
Angga.